The fog rolled in thick that morning, casting a gauzy veil over San Francisco's skyline. As Julia Renner stepped off the Muni bus at the financial district, she pulled her coat tighter around her frame. It wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the weight of everything, expectations, exhaustion, and the unrelenting grind of building a future in a city that too often demanded more than it gave back. She was 31 and every inch of her climb had been fought for. The marketing firm she worked for was prestigious, cutthroat, and unapologetically elitist. Most of her colleagues had Ivy League diplomas and trust funds that cushioned their landings. Julia had scholarships, 3 side jobs in college, and a younger brother back home in Oakland whose tuition she still helped pay. She wasn't supposed to be in the boardroom that day. She had been covering for her boss who'd called in sick with the flu. It was a quarterly pitch review, the kind of meeting where people like her took notes and brought coffee. But her boss had insisted she present the campaign strategy she'd spent weeks polishing. Reluctantly and with a racing heart, she had stepped into the glass conference room. Alexander Pierce was already seated at the head of the table. He wasn't what she expected. Photos in Forbes and Business Insider made him look colder, distant. Here in person, he was more arresting. Tall, with a sculpted intensity that seemed at odds with the calm in his grey eyes, he wore his wealth like it was secondary to the force of his presence. His reputation preceded him, founder of Pierce Global Holdings, a billionaire before 40, the kind of man who could bankrupt the city or rebuild it with a single investment. Julia cleared her throat and launched into the presentation. Her voice was steady, the room silent except for the hum of the projector and the soft click of slides. She talked about engagement metrics, consumer psychology, brand equity. But more than that, she talked about people, what they felt, why. They cared, how the right message could cut through noise and land where it mattered most, the heart. When she finished, the silence stretched long enough to make her pulse flutter. Then Alexander leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his gaze trained entirely on her. "Who wrote this?" he asked. "I did," Julia answered, bracing for dismissal. Instead, he nodded, thoughtful. "You see things others don't. That's rare in this business." It was only then she noticed something in his expression. Not curiosity, recognition. He knew her, or at least he remembered her. Because 5 years earlier, Julia had worked an event at the Ritz-Carlton, the Hoyo Os Pierce Foundation's annual benefit gala. She had been 26, manning the silent auction table in a second-hand gown and heels that pinched. He'd passed by, asked her a question about one of the items, and stayed longer than necessary, asking about her goals. She thought nothing of it at the time. Just a fleeting moment, kind but inconsequential. But that evening had stayed with her. Not because of his status, but because of his genuine interest. No one had asked her what she wanted in years. He did. Then he disappeared, back into a world of custom suits and private jets. And she returned to hers. Now, 5 years later, here he was again. Listening. Really listening. The meeting ended with polite applause and a request for her campaign to be fast-tracked to final proposal. Julia left the room in a daze, adrenaline, fading into disbelief. She didn't notice the way Alexander's eyes followed her, the way he paused as others spoke to him, distracted until she was gone. Later that night, back in her apartment with its squeaky floors and city views filtered through a fire escape, Julia replayed the moment over and over. The weight of his gaze, the way he'd said her name when she introduced herself, like he already knew it, like it meant something. She told herself not to think about it, not to romanticize a few minutes of professional interaction. He was a billionaire. She was a marketing manager with student debt and a 10-year-old Corolla. But Alexander wasn't dismissing the moment. In fact, he wasn't sleeping at all. At his penthouse in Nob Hill, he stood by floor-to-ceiling windows, nursing a glass of Macallan and staring into the fog. Julia Renner. He'd remembered her the moment she walked into the room. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, with that warm caramel skin, quicksilver eyes, and an elegance no designer could manufacture, but because of how she'd made him feel. The night of the gala, he'd been reeling. His mother had passed only weeks earlier, and he'd felt unmoored. Then he met Julia. Just a brief conversation, yet something in her energy, her clarity, her purpose had steadied him. She hadn't fawned or flattered. She'd looked him in the eye and answered his question with honesty and ambition. Then she disappeared, and he never saw her again. Until now, Alexander had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals. But what he felt when he watched her speak today was something entirely different. Yearning, awe, and a quiet fear that he might never be worthy of a woman like her. He'd always been decisive in business, yet when it came to Julia, he hesitated. She wasn't someone he could pursue casually. She wasn't someone he could buy. And he didn't want her to think he would try, but he wanted to know her, so he asked his assistant to set a follow-up meeting for the campaign review, one-on-one. Julia found the request in her inbox the next morning, a private review with Alexander Pierce. Her hands trembled as she opened the calendar invite. She told herself it was just business, that whatever butterflies danced in her stomach were irrelevant. But when she arrived at the meeting, Alexander was already waiting, not with notes or critiques, but coffee. Black for him, vanilla almond milk latte for her. She hadn't told anyone how she took it. I asked the barista, he said with a faint smile when she stared. You've been going to that corner cafe since you started working here. He remembered. They spoke for an hour, not just about the campaign, but about influence, innovation, and the future of ethical branding. Alexander was sharper than she expected, but also more reflective, more human. He asked questions that mattered, listened like he valued her answers. By the time she left, her mind was spinning, not from nerves, but from possibility. That night, she called her best friend Mia. He's different, she said, curled on the couch, sipping wine from a chipped mug. Different how? He makes me feel seen, not just noticed, known. Mia was quiet. Then, you think he remembers you from the gala? I think he never forgot. Neither had Julia, and neither, it seemed, had Alexander. He didn't text or email the next day. He sent a book, a first edition of a marketing theory she'd once quoted in a pitch. Inside the front cover, a handwritten note. For the woman who sees what others overlook, your vision deserves the loudest stage. AP. Julia held the book to her chest, heart pounding. Something had begun. Something neither of them could name yet. But it had been 5 years in the making, and it all started with a single glance in a conference room thick with glass and expectation. Julia Renner never believed in serendipity. In her world, dreams weren't handed to anyone. You fought, you strategized, and you sacrificed until life bent to your will. But ever since Alexander Pierce re-entered her orbit, she found herself questioning that logic. Things were happening. She couldn't explain. Calls from clients who previously ignored her pitches, quiet nods of approval from executives who had never even looked up from their phones. Her work was finally getting noticed, but it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a ripple effect from a single conversation. More than that, she felt changed. There was something terrifying and electric about knowing that someone like Alexander saw her. Not her title, not her credentials, her essence. It was dizzying, and it made her heart flutter in ways she hadn't let herself feel in years. He didn't reach out with bold declarations or empty flattery. That wasn't his style. Instead, there were gestures that felt impossibly intimate, like the playlist of classical jazz she discovered preloaded into a corporate presentation he shared. Tracks she used to play in college when she needed to focus, but never mentioned to anyone at work. Or the custom notepad with her name embossed at the top, delivered to her desk with no note, but the unmistakable scent of the same cologne he wore lingering on the box. She knew it was him. And she wasn't sure how to feel about it. Her world had always been practical, clean-lined, controlled. Love, especially the kind that stirred quietly between elevator glances and morning coffee runs, had no place in it. She tried to bury the thoughts, tried to focus on the campaign, on the analytics and proposals and metrics. But Alexander's presence was a gravity she couldn't ignore. And when he invited her to a gallery opening, a fundraiser for youth entrepreneurship hosted in one of the marina's most exclusive venues, she found herself saying yes before logic could catch up. That night, Julia chose a midnight blue gown, simple but elegant, and stepped into a world she'd only ever observed from the outside. The gallery shimmered with glass walls and gold-accented sculptures, and conversations floated through the air in accents from London, Milan, and Dubai. These were people who had never worried about overdraft fees or public transit strikes. Yet, as she entered, every head turned. Not because of her beauty, though she was radiant, but because of the man who met her at the entrance. Alexander. He didn't offer his hand. He simply said, "You came," like it meant everything, and it did. He led her through the gallery like she belonged there, introducing her not as an employee, not even as a colleague, but as someone whose ideas had changed the direction of his company's most important campaign. People listened. People watched. And Julia felt for the first time what it meant to stand next to someone who amplified you instead of eclipsing you. They ended the night on the gallery's rooftop overlooking the bay, lights glittering below like scattered stars. She leaned on the railing, the wind toying with her hair, and he stood beside her, hands in his pockets, gaze focused on the water. "I've been here 100 times, he said quietly. "But this is the first time it feels like something more than just a view." She looked at him then. Really looked. There was a softness in his features she hadn't seen before. A vulnerability that chipped away at the perfection he usually wore like armor. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it scares me." He nodded. "Me too." There was no kiss, no dramatic moment, just a silence filled with understanding. And in that quiet, something unspoken solidified between them. But the universe, as always, had other plans. The next day, Julia was called into HR. A complaint had been filed, anonymous of course, suggesting that her relationship with Alexander was compromising the integrity of her position on the campaign. The word favoritism was used. So was inappropriate conduct. She sat stiffly in the glass-walled office, every word from the HR representative cutting a little deeper. The campaign was being reassigned. She was being rotated to a new team, effective immediately. It wasn't punishment, they insisted, just protocol. Julia knew better. She left the building numb, her steps automatic, her breath shallow. She didn't call Alexander. She didn't know if she was angry at him or angry at herself for thinking the world would ever let them exist without consequence. But he found out anyway. The following evening, he was waiting for her outside her apartment, his luxury sedan, parked unassumingly at the curb. He didn't say anything when she stepped out of the building. He simply opened the passenger door and waited. She hesitated, then climbed in. They drove in silence for a while through winding streets and moonlit avenues until they reached Land's End. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, dark and roaring. He parked and turned off the engine, but made no move to get out. "They pushed you off the campaign," he said. "It wasn't a question." She nodded, staring ahead. "It's fine. I'll be fine." "It's not fine," he said quietly. "And it's my fault." "No, it's not. It's the system. It's always been the system." He looked at her then, eyes fierce. "I've spent my life bending systems to my will. Why didn't I see this coming?" "Because you don't live in the same version of the world that I do," she said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "You don't have to worry about how things look. I do." He winced, the truth of it sinking deep. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said. "I never meant to. I know." She exhaled slowly, her hand resting on the console between them. "But that doesn't change the reality." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then he reached over and gently took her hand. "I don't want to stop seeing you," he said. "But if it's hurting your future, I'll back away. You matter more than whatever this could become." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. Not because she wanted him to go, but because he'd offered. Because he understood. "I don't want you to go," she whispered. And with that, the line shifted again. It wasn't about power or privilege. It was about something rawer, deeper. A kind of loyalty born not from obligation, but from choice. In the days that followed, Julia's professional life recalibrated. Her new team welcomed her with cautious politeness, unsure whether she was ascending or falling from grace. Rumors swirled, of course. They always did. But Julia stayed silent, focused, determined not to let speculation define her story. And Alexander? He kept his distance publicly, but privately, their connection only deepened. Late-night phone calls that turned into confessions. Weekend walks in neighborhoods where no one knew his name. Conversations about childhood fears and adult regrets. He told her about his mother, about how losing her fractured something in him he never fully repaired. She told him about her brother, about how raising him after their parents died had shaped everything she did. They weren't two people from opposite worlds anymore. They were just two people, lonely, scarred, and hungry for something real. And then, one Friday evening, he asked her to accompany him to the Pierce Foundation gala. Her heart stopped. "Are you sure?" she asked. He smiled gently. "I'm not asking you to make a statement. I'm asking you to be with me, if that's something you still want." Julia nodded, but she knew the night would be more than a date. It would be a test of them, of what the world was willing to allow, and she wasn't sure they'd pass. The night of the Pierce Foundation. Gala arrived like a reckoning. Julia stood in front of the mirror in her modest Pacific Heights apartment, adjusting the straps of a dress that shimmered like liquid bronze under the soft glow of her bedroom light. It had taken her weeks to find. Something that balanced elegance with restraint, opulence with discretion. She wasn't trying to blend in, but she wasn't trying to make a statement either. All she wanted was to feel worthy of standing beside Alexander Pierce. Not as a charity case or a social experiment, but as his equal. Her reflection stared back with a quiet intensity. The woman in the mirror wasn't a product of chance. She was steel-forged in hardship, refined by ambition, shaped by a lifetime of sacrifice. And tonight she would walk into a ballroom filled with people who had no idea what it cost her to get there. The black car arrived promptly at 7. When the door opened and she stepped out in front of San Francisco's Fairmont Hotel, transformed into a palace of glass and candlelight for the occasion, a ripple of attention passed through the crowd. Flashbulbs sparked. Conversations paused, heads turned. But Julia didn't falter. She walked forward, every step echoing with self-possession. And then she saw him. Alexander stood at the entrance, tall and devastating in a tailored midnight suit. The usual polish he wore so effortlessly was softened tonight by something more vulnerable. His eyes found hers instantly. A smile, slow, real and unguarded, spread across his face. He didn't greet her with words. He offered his arm. She took it. Inside, the ballroom glittered like a dream. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light across marble floors. Violins singing softly above the buzz of old money and veiled ambition. Every corner was draped in elegance, but to Julia it all felt slightly unreal. Like walking through a scene she had no script for. She could feel the eyes on her. She knew the whispers had already started. Who is she? Why her? Where did she come from? Alexander, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered. He guided her through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing her to CEOs and dignitaries and socialites as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "This is Julia Renner," he said more than once, his voice laced with admiration. "She's one of the sharpest minds I've ever worked with." He never said she was his date. He never needed to. But the room noticed. Julia kept her smile poised, her hands steady, her conversation polite. But beneath the surface, nerves crackled like a storm. Every laugh, every toast, every sideways glance felt loaded with implication. She could see it in their eyes, the polite skepticism, the silent judgment. She didn't belong, not in their world, not beside a man like him. It all came to a head during the auction. As Julia stood beside Alexander, watching guests raise paddles for diamond-drenched vacation packages and collector's artwork, she felt a presence approach. A woman, tall, statuesque, wearing a blood-red gown and an air of effortless entitlement. "Alex," the woman purred, brushing a kiss against his cheek. "You've been hiding." Alexander turned, pleasant but reserved. "Margot, I didn't know you were in town." "Just for the gala," Margot said, her eyes drifting toward Julia with a smile too smooth to be sincere. "And who's this?" Before he could speak, Julia extended her hand. "Julia Renner, a colleague." Margot's smile sharpened. "Charmed, I'm sure. You must be very talented to earn such an invitation." The implication wasn't subtle. Julia's heart clenched, but she didn't flinch. "I like to think so," she replied, steady. "And lucky enough to work with people who recognize that." Margot laughed lightly. "Well, Alex always did have a thing for brilliance, among other things." Alexander's hand gently touched Julia's lower back, quiet reassurance. "Margot, it was good to see you. We'll catch up later." He led Julia away before the tension could boil, but the damage had already rippled through her. They found a quiet alcove near the balcony, away from the curated spectacle. Julia turned toward the night air, her hands gripping the railing. "She's beautiful," she said quietly. "She's irrelevant," he replied. Julia exhaled, shaky. "It's not just her, Alex. It's all of it. The looks, the whispers. I know what they think, that I don't belong here, that I'm some project you've taken on between mergers." "You're not a project," he said firmly. "You're the most authentic person in this room." She turned to face him. "But that doesn't matter, does it? Not to them. To them, I'll always be the outsider, no matter what I do." His eyes darkened. "Then to hell with them." A silence stretched between them. And then he added softer, I didn't invite you here to impress anyone, Julia. I brought you here because when I picture my future, I see you in it, not as an accessory, as the anchor. Her breath caught. I know what this looks like, he continued. I know how it feels, but I'm not afraid of the noise. I'm only afraid of losing something that finally feels real. Her heart cracked open. Not because it was the perfect thing to say, but because it wasn't rehearsed. It was honest, messy, true. She reached up, touched his cheek, and that's when it happened. Their first kiss, not in secret, not hidden, but in full view of the golden ballroom, under the soft glow of the chandeliers and the watching eyes of 100 disbelievers. It was not dramatic. It was not posed. It was quiet, unapologetic. And when it ended, they just stood there, forehead to forehead, breathing the same air. He held her hand as they returned to the party. And for the rest of the night, no one dared whisper. Later, as the gala wound down and the ballroom began to empty, Alexander turned to her. Come with me, he said. She nodded. They walked the marina at midnight, the city lights painting the water with broken stars. For once, there were no expectations, no cameras, just the hush of waves and the soft cadence of footsteps. They didn't talk about work, or strategy, or reputations. They talked about childhood scars and second chances, about the books that changed them, the losses that shaped them, and the futures they were both scared to imagine. And somewhere between laughter and silence, Alexander stopped walking. I never told you this, he said, looking out at the horizon, but I noticed you long before that gala. She tilted her head. What do you mean? I saw your interview 2 years ago, that piece on PBS about inner city startups. You were so passionate, so fierce. I remember thinking, who is this woman who speaks like her ideas could save the world? Julia stared at him. I kept the clip, he admitted. I watched it whenever I lost faith in what I was building. Emotion swelled in her chest. She didn't know what to say. So she kissed him again. This time with everything she couldn't put into words. And in that kiss, every wall she'd ever built came crashing down. The days following the gala were unlike anything Julia had ever known. In the weeks before, her name had only meant something in tight-knit business circles and innovation summits. Now it echoed through corridors she had never thought she'd enter. Suddenly, she was the face in 1,000,000 searches, the question mark in 1,000 conversations, the object of fascination for strangers who knew nothing about her heart, but everything about her dress, her kiss, and her proximity to Alexander Pierce. She ignored the headlines. Tried to at least, but they came relentless and loud. The unknown who stole San Francisco's most eligible billionaire. Social climber or Cinderella? Who is Julia Renner? Her inbox overflowed. Her work was interrupted by reporters masquerading as clients. People she hadn't spoken to in years reached out, some congratulating, others probing, and a few with thinly veiled jealousy painted as curiosity. Julia told herself none of it mattered. But when she sat alone in her apartment, when the noise dulled and the silence returned, she felt it pressing down on her chest like a weight. Alexander noticed, one evening, as they sat in his penthouse loft overlooking the bay, her curled into the crook of his arm, his thumb tracing slow circles. Over her hand, he asked, "Is this too much?" Julia hesitated. Then quietly, "It's not you. It's the everything else." He nodded, not needing more. She had never craved fame. Recognition, yes, respect always. But not this fishbowl existence where every move felt dissected, every smile analyzed. The Julia they talked about online wasn't her. It was a distorted echo, and she didn't know how to reclaim her own name from it. "I can shield you," he offered one night. Julia turned to him, brow furrowed. "How? I've done it before. I can make it all go away. Bury stories, kill speculation, steer the spotlight somewhere else." But she shook her head. "I don't want to disappear. I just don't want to be reduced to a headline." He looked at her with something close to sorrow. "Then we'll ride it out. Together." And they tried. They took walks along the quiet trails of Muir Woods, escaped to wine country for weekends without signal, cooked in silence, read in bed, made love under soft jazz and candlelight. For a time, they carved out something real amid the unreal. something sacred amid the spectacle. But cracks have a way of finding their way into even the most carefully built foundations. It started with the boardroom. Julia had never let her personal life interfere with her work, but she noticed it. An edge in the voices during meetings, a shift in tone when she spoke. Clients who used to treat her as a strategist now treated her as a gateway to Alexander. At first she brushed it off, but when one potential investor dismissed her entire pitch and then turned to Alexander and said, "Well, if you're vouching for her, I guess we'll reconsider." Something inside her snapped. Later that evening, she confronted Alexander in his study. "I can fight for my own credibility," she said. "But if you keep stepping in to save me, I won't have any left." He was silent for a long moment. Then, "I wasn't trying to save you. I just wanted them to see what I see." "They'll never see it," she whispered, "if they think I'm only here because of you." Alexander didn't argue, but he didn't apologize either. Another crack, then came the message. It was late, well past midnight, when her phone lit up with a notification. An email, no subject line, no sender name, just a string of attachments. Photos, screenshots, a timeline. Julia opened them with trembling hands. There he was, Alexander, years ago. Smiling at Margot in Monaco, walking hand in hand in Marrakesh, whispering in her ear at a yacht party in Cannes. Texts followed, flirtatious, intimate, unmistakably personal. She wasn't stupid. She knew about his past, but the timing, the overlap made her stomach twist. Margot had made it sound like history, but this didn't feel like history. The next morning, Julia didn't go to work. She didn't answer Alexander's calls. Instead, she took the train to the coast, wrapped herself in a scarf, and walked the bluffs above Half Moon Bay until her legs ached and her thoughts became manageable. When she returned, Alexander was waiting on her steps. "I never lied to you," he said the moment she unlocked the door. Julia stood there silent. "She sent those to break us. Did she succeed?" He stepped forward. "Only if you believe her more than you believe me." Julia wanted to. God, she wanted to. But trust wasn't something she gave easily, not after a life of disappointment, not when it mattered this much. "Were you still seeing her after you met me?" "No." "Were you in love with her?" "No." "Did you think of her ever when we were together?" A beat of silence. "That's not fair," he said finally. And in that moment, Julia understood. He hadn't physically betrayed her, but something in him still lived in that world, still craved the easiness of it, the shine. Margot represented a version of Alexander he hadn't fully outgrown, and Julia, with all her sharp edges and principled fire, represented something else, accountability. She closed the door, not as punishment, but as pause. She needed space, to think, to breathe, to remember who she was when no one was watching. Days turned into a week. During that time, Julia threw herself into work, real work, not curated fundraisers or whispered introductions. She returned to her roots, mentoring high school girls in underserved neighborhoods, rebuilding the accelerator she had once started before the whirlwind of Alexander's world had consumed it. And there, amid chalkboards and cheap coffee and stubborn teenagers with too much brilliance to be boxed in, Julia remembered why she had started all this. It wasn't for him. It was for her. For the girl who had grown up believing dreams were only for other people. For the woman who had clawed her way into spaces that never invited her. And when Alexander showed up at the center, 3 days unshaven, jacket in his hands, hope in his eyes, Julia didn't rush to meet him. She let him wait like she had waited for clarity. Finally, she walked up to him. "I miss you," he said, voice raw. "I miss us," she replied. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing more, until she took his hand. And this time, the fracture didn't shatter them. It forced them to rebuild. They didn't talk for long that afternoon. Words felt fragile, too easily bent into weapons. So they walked, down the winding path that circled the community center, past children playing and mothers chatting, and lives unfolding with a kind of simplicity neither of them had known in a long while. As they walked, Julia kept her gaze forward, but her fingers found his, slowly. Not in surrender, but in recognition. "You know," she said finally, "I used to think love was supposed to fix everything. That when the right person came along, all the broken parts would stitch themselves together. Alexander glanced at her, unsure where she was headed. But that's not what this is, she continued. Love doesn't fix things. It shows you where the breaks are. It holds up a mirror. Sometimes it hurts, but sometimes it helps you find the strength to fix them yourself. He nodded slowly. And do you think we can? She turned to him. I think we owe it to ourselves to try, but not by pretending nothing cracked. We rebuild, brick by brick. And I need to do some of that work on my own too. That night Julia went home alone again. Not out of anger, but out of resolve. And it was during that space between them that both of them began to transform. Alexander, who had always commanded rooms and conquered markets, found himself attending therapy for the first time in his life. Not because she had asked, but because for the first time he wanted to understand the parts of himself that clung to control, to performance, to validation through legacy. He began to untangle his childhood, the distant father, the constant pressure. He even called his sister in London, someone he hadn't spoken to in over a year, and apologized. Julia, meanwhile, dove deeper into the work that grounded her. She met with old mentors, listened to the stories of young women with big dreams and no maps. She reconnected with her mother, who had spent years unsure how to support a daughter chasing something she herself had never dreamed possible. They had dinner one evening, just the two of them. And for the first time, Julia saw her mother not just as a parent, but as a woman, a survivor of her own disappointments and quiet triumphs. I see now, her mother said over tea. You were never meant to live small, but you don't have to burn yourself out proving it. Those words stayed with her. One morning, a month later, Julia stood in front of her mirror and didn't recognize the girl from the gala. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, her face makeup-free. She wore a simple navy blazer, her favorite boots, scuffed from dozens of long days. And she smiled, because this was the version of herself that felt real, that felt earned. That evening she got an invitation. It wasn't from Alexander. Not directly. It came from his assistant. A formal event. A foundation gala, this time not in honor of old wealth or exclusive art, but to support urban education initiatives across California. The guest list included educators, entrepreneurs, community leaders. Julia's name was listed as a keynote speaker. No fanfare, just recognition. She arrived in a modest car alone. The event was held in an old converted theater in the Mission District, exposed brick, warm lighting, live jazz playing softly in the background. The room was filled with purpose, not pretension. And then she saw him, Alexander, across the room in a charcoal suit, speaking quietly with one of the program directors. He didn't see her at first, but when he did, the noise around him seemed to fall away. He made no grand gesture, no rush. Just a small smile, a question and a hope. She nodded once, slowly. Later that night, after her speech about sustainable mentorship models and access-driven innovation, he found her at the bar. You were brilliant, he said. Thanks, she replied, letting the silence stretch. Then softly he asked, Can we start again? Julia tilted her head. From where? From here, where we are now, not where we were. She looked at him for a long moment. No more saving me. No more controlling you, he agreed. No more secrets. Only truth. She breathed in, and then reached for his hand. I still don't know how this ends, she said. Neither do I, he replied. But maybe, she said with a gentle smile, we don't need an ending, just a beginning worth showing up for. And with that, something settled between them. Not resolution, but alignment. They were no longer two people, colliding in chaos. They were two people who had unraveled and rebuilt, not perfectly, but intentionally, with choice, with truth, and perhaps that was the love that lasted. Not the one that arrived like a storm, but the one that stayed like a sunrise. Would you like me to now proceed with part 5 in the same tone and emotional depth? The morning after the gala, Julia sat by her window, a mug of black coffee warming her hands. Outside, the San Francisco fog curled against the glass like breath. She felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Not resolution, not yet, but a gentle kind of peace. Like standing at the shoreline, knowing the tide was finally pulling in your favor. She hadn't gone home with Alexander the night before. They had said goodnight like grown-ups, not lovers aching for closure. Because this wasn't about passion anymore. It was about possibility. And still her heart beat a little quicker when she saw his name appear on her phone screen that afternoon. Walk with me, the message said. They met in Golden Gate Park beneath the ancient eucalyptus trees. The world around them bustled with life. Children laughing, dogs chasing frisbees, joggers weaving between the trails. But inside that pocket of green, it felt like time slowed for them alone. Do you ever wonder what we would have been if we met differently? Alexander asked as they strolled. All the time, Julia replied. But maybe it's not about when we met. Maybe it's about who we are when we find each other again. He took that in, nodding. You said something once. That love shows us where the breaks are. I've been thinking about that a lot. She looked at him closely. There was something gentler in his face now, less guarded. I'm learning to be okay with not being perfect, he said, not always having the answers. I used to think power was in control, in always being 3 steps ahead. But now, I think it's in standing still and saying, I don't know, but I'm here. Julia stopped walking, turned to face him fully. That's all I ever needed, she said. Someone willing to be here, to really be here. The weeks that followed weren't magical, not in the fairy tale sense. They didn't vanish into each other or lose sight of the world. Instead, they started something radically ordinary. And, in that deeply sacred, they began seeing each other twice a week. Sometimes they had dinner at small local bistros. Other times they cooked at Julia's apartment. They watched old films, traded stories from their childhoods, argued about books and policy and the best sushi spot in town. It was messy and real and vulnerable. One evening, as they sat cross-legged on the floor of Julia's living room surrounded by takeout containers and paperwork, she glanced at him and said, This is the first time I've felt safe with someone in years. Alexander reached over and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. That means more than you know. Their relationship, once defined by explosive beginnings and sharp corners, began to soften. It wasn't that the passion disappeared, it simply settled, became something steadier, a foundation. Still, they had things to untangle, especially when the world outside began to notice them again. A photo leaked, an image of them at a fundraising event, holding hands in a moment neither of them knew was being captured. Headlines followed. Billionaire back with brilliant ex, tech tycoon reignites romance with education activist. The press loved the contrast. The reformed playboy and the principled idealist. Julia, once fiercely protective of her private life, recoiled. I don't want to be someone's redemption. Och, she said one night as they sat across from each other at his kitchen island. You're not, Alexander said, his voice low. You're the reason I decided I didn't want to be lost anymore. She softened, but the tension lingered. The weight of visibility, the discomfort of becoming a symbol. They talked about it. Argued sometimes, but always came back to one thing, truth, radical, unvarnished truth. I don't need a savior, Julia said during one of their harder conversations. I need a partner, one who doesn't flinch when it gets hard. I'm not flinching, Alexander replied. I'm standing still. It was in those moments, those raw, quiet reckonings, that they began to build a future. Not a fantasy, but a life. They started working together, carefully and deliberately. Julia became a consultant for Alexander's foundation, helping reimagine its mission. She suggested programs focused on equity in education, mentorship for first-generation college students, and access to mental health support in underserved communities. Alexander listened, invested, not just his money, but his time, his presence. At one meeting, Julia watched as he sat with a group of high school students from East Oakland, asking about their dreams and fears and what they needed most from the adults in their lives. He didn't speak over them. He didn't offer solutions. He just listened. Later that night, she turned to him in bed, her hand resting on his chest. That was the most powerful I've ever seen you, she whispered. He kissed her temple. That was the most human I've ever felt. Love, it turned out, was not a singular act. It was a practice, a choice made daily, sometimes hourly. And in choosing each other, again and again they began to uncover a version of themselves neither had dared to hope for. But as they moved closer, so did the shadows of the past. One morning, Julia received an email, anonymous, a forwarded article from a business magazine, dated 5 years earlier. It detailed a hostile takeover Alexander had led, one that resulted in hundreds losing their jobs. The article hinted at ethical gray areas, strategic ruthlessness. Julia remembered hearing about it at the time but hadn't known Alexander then. Now it felt like a fracture. She confronted him that evening. The article pulled up on her laptop. "Did you know what this would do to people?" she asked, her voice tight. Alexander's face was unreadable for a moment. Then slowly he nodded. "I did," he said. "And I did it anyway. Because back then all I cared about was the game. Winning. Building the legacy my father never thought I could." Julia swallowed hard. "And now? Now I care about what happens after I leave the room. About the stories people tell about me when I'm not listening." She watched him, searching for something in his eyes. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," he said, "but I want your trust. And I'm willing to earn it. Every day." She didn't reply right away. Instead, she reached for his hand and held it tightly. "Then let's build something we won't be ashamed of." In that moment, they weren't a millionaire and a reformer. They weren't headlines or archetypes. They were just two people. Flawed. Trying. Choosing each other despite everything. And for now, that was enough. Weeks turned into months. And what began as a cautious reconnection slowly matured into a partnership defined not just by affection but by shared purpose. Julia and Alexander weren't merely lovers rediscovering what they had lost. They were collaborators shaping something that could outlast either of them. One of Julia's boldest proposals was a scholarship initiative aimed specifically at empowering young women in tech from underrepresented backgrounds. Alexander, who had once spent years in boardrooms dominated by men, recognized the urgency. He not only greenlit the idea, he helped expand it. "We don't just fund them," he said in one meeting. "We mentor them. We build a pipeline, not just a platform." Together, they launched the Luminary Fellowship. The inaugural gala was scheduled 6 months from their conversation in Golden Gate Park, at the very same venue where Julia had first kissed him under glittering lights and whispered histories. The symbolism was not lost on either of them, but as the stakes grew higher, so did the risks. One afternoon, while Julia was finalizing keynote materials in her home office, she received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was cold, direct. "You don't know everything about him. You should." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Minutes later, an encrypted file was delivered to her inbox. Inside were documents, real ones, indicating that a recent acquisition Alexander's holding company had completed was linked to offshore tax shelters. Nothing illegal, but ethically murky. Julia's stomach dropped. This wasn't old news. This was now. That evening, she confronted him, heart hammering in her chest. "Tell me it's not true," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Alexander exhaled slowly. "I was cleaning it up. Quietly. Before it exploded. It was a decision. Made by my CFO while I was in Geneva last year. I didn't even know until a month ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want this us to get tainted by it. And because I was afraid." Julia stepped back. "Afraid of losing me?" He nodded. "Afraid you'd stop believing in me. And without that, Julia, I'm not sure I know who I am anymore." The truth was, part of her had lost faith. Not in his intentions, but in the world they were trying to change. Could a system so deeply flawed ever truly be reformed from within? She needed space, not as punishment, but for clarity. Over the next week, they didn't speak. Julia threw herself into her work. She spent hours with scholarship candidates, interviewing them, listening to their stories. One young woman, Lena, a 17-year-old coding prodigy from the Bronx, looked her dead in the eyes during a mentoring session and said, "I'm not afraid of the mistakes I've made. I'm only afraid of not learning from them." That night, Julia lay awake in bed thinking about Alexander, about their mistakes, about learning. She called him the next morning, asked him to meet her at the rooftop garden of the ferry building, where the city skyline kissed the water. "I don't need perfection," she told him as he approached. "I need truth, even when it's ugly. That's all I can promise. You," he said, "no more curated versions. No more damage control. Just me." They stood there, the wind tugging gently at her coat, his hand finding hers. "And what about the fellowship?" she asked. "What happens if your name drags it? Down? Then we give it to someone else. Someone clean. You maybe. Or someone who's never had to learn the hard way. But the idea lives. That's what matters." In that moment, she realized something. The measure of love wasn't in grand gestures or passionate confessions. It was in sacrifice, in letting go of ego, in wanting the mission more than the credit. She leaned into him, her voice steady. then we do it together. With honesty, with scars, with every piece of who we are. That night, as they stood shoulder to shoulder reviewing final designs for the gala program, Alexander whispered something she hadn't heard from him in years. "I'm proud of you, Julia, and I'm proud to stand beside you." It wasn't a declaration. It was a vow. Their journey wasn't over. There would still be headlines, still be nights of doubt, still be shadows to outpace. But now they were walking forward, not as two broken people trying to fill each other's gaps, but as two whole ones ready to build something that mattered. And beneath all the uncertainty, one truth anchored them. This was just the beginning. The city shimmered that night, a velvet tapestry lit by ambition and dreams. The gala had arrived, an event months in the making, built not only with wealth and elegance, but with grit, grace, and a growing sense of redemption. Inside the San Francisco Conservatory of Flowers, the glass dome pulsed with golden light, as if the stars themselves had descended to witness this moment. Julia stood at the entrance, breath catching in her throat. She wore a gown the color of crushed amethyst, modest yet commanding. Her hair swept into an effortless chignon, eyes rimmed with purpose. Around her bustled dignitaries, philanthropists, artists, activists, individuals drawn not just by prestige but by belief. Belief in what this night stood for. Belief in the future. And somewhere in that crowd, Alexander watched her. He didn't approach at first. He wanted to see her in motion, see the way she commanded the room, the way people gravitated to her. She had grown in the months since their reunion. Not just returned to her old self, but transformed into someone even more powerful. She wasn't just the woman he loved. She was a force. When he finally crossed the room to her, he didn't speak right away. He simply took her hand, kissed her knuckles gently, and let the warmth between them fill the space where words might have once stumbled. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Let's begin." The evening unfolded with a rhythm that felt both orchestrated and organic. Speeches were made, some fiery, some tender. Testimonials from scholarship recipients drew tears from guests who weren't accustomed to crying in public. A string quartet played as dinner was served, and Julia watched faces soften with every shared story of transformation. And then, it was her turn. She stood behind the podium facing a sea of influential faces, and for a moment the weight of everything nearly collapsed her resolve. But then she saw Lena, seated at table 5, wearing a simple navy dress, fingers clasped with nervous excitement. And just behind her she saw Alexander. He didn't smile, didn't signal. He simply looked at her the way he always had, like she was already enough. "Good evening," Julia began, her voice steady, rich with feeling. "When we talk about opportunity, we often imagine doors that need opening. But for many, those doors were never built. Tonight is about building them, together." She shared her story, not the polished version but the honest one. About growing up believing she had to earn her place in every room. About failing. About leaving. About coming back, not with perfection but with purpose. She spoke of Alexander too without naming him. She spoke of second chances, of the audacity it takes to trust again, of the courage it demands to change not only the world but oneself. When she finished, the silence was thick and reverent. Then applause rose, slow, deliberate, swelling into a standing ovation that shook the air with thunderous respect, but amid the applause, she looked only at him, and he was already standing. Later that night, as the guests danced and toasted, Julia escaped to the edge of the garden terrace, seeking air. Alexander followed a moment later. "Tell me what you're thinking," he asked gently. She exhaled, wrapping her arms around herself. "That I've never felt more seen, or more afraid of losing it." "You're not going to lose it," he said, stepping behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Because this time you're not doing it alone." They stood there in silence for a moment, listening to the soft music drifting from the conservatory, the laughter, the life. Then Alexander reached into his coat pocket. "I wasn't sure when the right time would be," he murmured. "But maybe the right time isn't something we wait for. Maybe it's something we choose." Julia turned to face him, heart thudding. He didn't drop to one knee, not because the gesture wasn't worthy, but because this wasn't about tradition. This was about truth. "I love you, Julia. I've loved you in silence, in chaos, in rebuilding. And I want a life where we don't keep restarting. I want one where we continue." He opened the box. Inside was a ring unlike any other. An uncut diamond encased in a rose gold setting, raw and brilliant. It's imperfect, he said. But it's real, like us. Tears slipped from her eyes unashamed. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. He kissed her then, not with the urgency of lost time, but with the quiet certainty of what was to come. Inside, the gala soared toward its finale. But out on that terrace, beneath the moonlight of a city that had seen them break and rebuild, Julia and Alexander wrote the most important line of their story not with words, but with faith. The future wasn't promised, but tonight it had been claimed. After Julia accepted his proposal, they stood for a while longer in quiet intimacy. The city spread before them like a constellation of every possibility they had once believed unreachable. And yet here they were, not because fate had favored them, but because they had fought hard for this moment. But even within this triumph, a tinge of fear lingered in Julia's chest. Not fear of him, or of the commitment. It was something deeper. A fear that even love, powerful and sincere, might not be enough to erase what the past had left behind. That night, after the last guest departed and the catering staff began to sweep away the remains of the evening, Julia and Alexander stayed behind in the now quiet venue. The staff smiled knowingly and left them alone. In the silence of the empty conservatory, Julia sat on a bench among the orchids, shoes off, dress rumpled, hair a little undone. It was the first time she'd felt truly herself all day. "I used to come here after work when I was younger," she said. "I'd sit right here, just to feel like I was part of something alive." Alexander sat beside her. "You are part of something alive now. Something beautiful." She turned to him, serious. "What if I mess it up?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down, pulled off his shoes too, and mirrored her posture. "You will," he said softly. "And so will I. We'll both mess up. We'll hurt each other. We'll disappoint each other. But that's what love is, Julia. It's not the absence of mistakes. It's the presence of forgiveness." Her throat tightened. "I wish I'd known that sooner." He smiled sadly. "So do I. But maybe we had to break apart to understand how to stay whole." They stayed there until dawn began to color the glass panels with a blush of morning. In that in-between hour, when night has ended but day has not fully arrived, Julia realized something vital, something beyond the speeches and the accolades. It wasn't just the success of the gala that moved her. It was knowing she hadn't needed to do it perfectly to be worthy of love, that she hadn't needed to be flawless to be seen. She had only needed to be real. The following days unfolded in a strange dreamlike rhythm. Media outlets ran glowing, stories about the event. Donations surged, partnerships blossomed, and Julia found herself swept into meetings, interviews, planning sessions. She should have felt triumphant, but she felt something else, unsteady. Her old tendency to take on everything alone crept back in. She began staying late again, micromanaging, working until her voice rasped and her fingers trembled. Alexander noticed. One evening, he arrived at her office to find her surrounded by spreadsheets and grant applications, staring at the screen, as if it might swallow her. "You forgot dinner," he said gently. She blinked. "I meant to. There was just so much. Come home." "I can't. Not yet." He stepped in, knelt beside her chair. "Julia, you're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry it like this." Tears welled unbidden. "I don't know how to stop," he took her hand. "Then let me help you learn." That night they went home, not to a grand estate or high-rise penthouse, but to a quiet apartment they had rented temporarily during renovations. It was modest, warm, filled with stacks of books and mismatched mugs. He made tea. She changed into one of his old shirts. They didn't talk about work. They talked about nothing. And it healed more than any grand gesture ever could. In the following weeks, Julia learned to delegate. She leaned into her team. She listened to Alexander when he reminded her to rest. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't sacrificing success by surrendering control. She was deepening it. The wedding plans moved forward slowly, intentionally. They didn't rush. Instead, they focused on creating a life together, day by day. They took Lena to the coast on weekends. They cooked terrible meals and laughed at the disasters. They argued too, but always returned to the same truth. They chose each other, and with each ordinary moment, their love deepened into something unshakable. The night before the wedding, Julia visited her mother's grave. She hadn't been in years. She brought fresh peonies, her mother's favorite, and sat in the grass. "I wish you could see me now," she whispered. "I wish you could meet him. You'd like him. He's quiet but strong. And kind." She wiped her tears and smiled. "You always told me not to chase perfection. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I really do." She stood, brushed off her dress, and turned toward tomorrow. The morning of the wedding dawned with the soft hush of fog over San Francisco Bay. From her hotel suite overlooking the water, Julia stood barefoot by the tall windows, her silk robe brushing the tops of her knees, her heart suspended between serenity and storm. The city she had called home for years stretched out before her, still hushed, reverent, as if holding its breath for her. Her dress hung in the corner, light as cloud and just as ethereal. But it was not the gown that made her breath catch. In her throat, it was the journey that had brought her to this threshold. She thought of the girl she used to be, ambitious to a fault, shielding her heart behind ambition, hardened by betrayal and the weight of being left behind. And she thought of the man who had waited for her, not just in quiet years, but in every heartbeat, in every choice to remain when it would have been easier to leave. Her hand drifted to her chest, resting over the soft pulse of her heart. Today, she would promise forever to Alexander. As if summoned by thought, her phone lit up with a message. "Can't wait to see you at the altar. You are my always." She smiled. Not everything had gone smoothly. There had been disagreements. With vendors, a thunderstorm predicted for the afternoon, and even a last-minute seating chart disaster. But Julia had learned to see beauty in the chaos. Love wasn't perfection. Love was persistence, presence, choosing someone, every single day. Hours later, in the tranquil garden of a historic Sonoma estate, under a canopy of eucalyptus and flowering wisteria, the ceremony began. Lina walked down the aisle first, a vision in a pale blue dress, holding a bouquet almost as large as her. She beamed at Julia as she passed, eyes shimmering with quiet pride. She had insisted on giving her blessing to Alexander the night before in a hilariously formal conversation over hot chocolate and marshmallows. "You make my mom happy," she had said. "But if you ever don't, I'm very good at finding people on the internet." Alexander had promised gravely to do his best. Now he stood at the altar in a classic black suit, looking more like the man Julia had always seen. Strong, elegant, deeply human, than the millionaire the headlines loved to write about. When she appeared at the top of the aisle, silence fell over the garden. She walked slowly, deliberately. Not out of hesitation, but reverence. Every step was a memory. Every breath, a vow. Alexander's eyes never left hers. When they joined hands, under the arch of flowers, the officiant's voice blurred into the background. Julia only saw him, only heard the quiet beat of possibility between them. "Julia," he said when it was time to speak, "I loved you before you knew me. I loved you when you didn't believe in yourself. I loved you through distance, through doubt, through silence. But what matters most is this. I love you now, and I choose to love you every day that comes after." Her voice trembled when she answered. "Alexander, I was always afraid that love would take from me, that it would strip me of who I was. But with you I've only become more brave, more open, more myself. You didn't complete me, you reminded me I was already whole. But together we are something extraordinary." There wasn't a dry eye among the guests when they kissed. Later, at the reception under strings of golden lights, laughter mingled with music and champagne flowed. Speeches were given, some eloquent, some chaotic, all heartfelt. Lina's toast was a crowd favorite. "I used to think weddings were boring," she declared, "but this one is cool. Also, I got to eat cake before dinner." Julia and Alexander danced their first dance to an old jazz tune they both secretly loved. He twirled her gently, careful of her heels, as she laughed into his chest. But the most unforgettable moment came not from the music or the toasts. It came when the power briefly flickered, just for a second, and the garden fell into darkness. A collective gasp went through the crowd. And then from the shadows a voice began to sing. Softly. Familiar. It was Alexander. Unplanned, unpolished, his voice carried the melody of the song they'd chosen for their first dance. Guests held their breath. Julia's hand flew to her mouth. "I didn't plan this," he said sheepishly after the final note. "But I couldn't let today pass without telling you again. How lucky I am." Applause erupted. Julia kissed him, unbothered by the tears, streaking her mascara. As the night wore on and the stars took their place overhead, the couple escaped the crowd for a moment, slipping into the quiet vineyard at the edge of the estate. Surrounded by the scent of earth and ripening grapes, Julia turned to Alexander. "Do you ever think about how close we came to missing this?" she asked. "Every day," he replied. She leaned into him. "Let's promise something. Anything. No matter how hard things get. We don't walk away. We pause. We breathe. But we never walk away." He looked down at her, his expression serious and tender. "We stay." She nodded. "We stay." The future stretched before them, not as a perfect path, but as a shared one. And that, Julia realized, was more than enough. In the months that followed, they built a life not marked by headlines or glamour, but by morning coffees and shared glances and the quiet sound of belonging. They traveled, sure. They hosted galas, but they also had game nights with Lena and movie marathons in their pajamas. They fought occasionally, but they always circled back to love. Their love wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady. It was true. It was theirs. After their intimate escape to the edge of the vineyard, the wedding reception continued to pulse with celebration. Julia and Alexander returned to the golden glow of the lights, greeted by warm cheers and a sea of faces that loved them. The band had resumed playing a mix of smooth jazz and vintage classics that perfectly framed the elegance of the evening. Satcherweiss. They mingled with guests. Julia couldn't help but feel a deep sense of completion. Not the kind that implied finality, but the quiet awareness that her life had finally settled into a rhythm of meaning. She no longer questioned if she was enough. She no longer wondered if happiness was a fleeting thing only meant for others. For the first time, she felt truly anchored in her own story. Her Aunt Marian, who had flown in from New York just for the occasion, caught her in a tight embrace. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she whispered, "and she would have adored Alexander." Tears welled up in Julia's eyes. She thought of her mother, gone too soon, and how often she had longed to share life's milestones with her. But in that moment, surrounded by family, Julia felt her presence in the very air, the way the breeze curled around the tables, the scent of roses, the warmth of every hug. Later in the evening, when the music softened and the candles burned lower, Alexander stood to speak again. This time, not with a microphone, not to the whole crowd, but to Julia. Just loud enough for her and those closest to them to hear. "I've made my share of mistakes," he said, his voice low and reflective. "I've chased the wrong dreams. I've hurt people by trying to protect myself. But the best decision I ever made was not giving up on us, even when we were miles apart, even when I didn't know if I'd ever have the chance to stand next to you like this. I don't want a perfect life. I want a real one. With you." Julia felt her heart swell with something too big to name. She reached for his hand, and in that gesture was everything they had survived. Every misunderstanding, every painful silence, every step toward reconciliation. As the stars deepened above them, a few couples began to leave, offering well wishes and hugs. The older guests went first, followed by the parents with sleeping children. But the core group remained, laughing, dancing barefoot, stealing bites of cake long after dinner had ended. Lena, now wrapped in a cozy shawl, sat perched at a fire pit with two of her new friends from school. She looked over at her mother, who was leaning against Alexander's shoulder, and gave a sleepy smile. "She looks different," Lena told her friends. Happy different. And she was right. The final song of the night was one Julia had requested quietly. It was not a love ballad, not something grand or showy. It was the song her mother used to hum while doing the dishes, a tune that meant home. As the melody floated through the air, Julia and Alexander danced slowly, alone at the center of the floor. Guests watched from their seats, many holding hands, with their own partners, reflecting on the power of witnessing a love that had taken the long road. With every turn, every sway, Julia felt the years collapsing into this single golden moment. She had found her way back, not just to love, but to herself. At the end of the dance, the applause was gentle but thunderous in meaning. "Let's get out of here," Alexander murmured into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. They slipped, away just before midnight, escaping into a vintage convertible parked under the old oaks near the estate entrance. As the car rolled away down the gravel road, cans clattering behind them and a just married sign swinging in the wind, Julia leaned her head back and laughed. It was the kind of laugh that healed old wounds, the kind that signaled something beautiful had begun. They spent their honeymoon on the Amalfi Coast, in a secluded villa overlooking the sea. Mornings were slow, filled with pastries and bare feet on stone balconies. Afternoons meant exploration, hidden coves, ancient ruins, long lunches under flowering pergolas. Evenings were their favorite, candle-lit dinners, stories shared without, the pressure of the past, and a quiet sense of belonging. One night, as they sat watching the waves, Alexander turned to her with a question. "Do you think we were always meant to end up here?" Julia looked at him, at the man who had once been, just a stranger at a gala. "I don't believe in fate," she said, "but I do believe in second chances, and in the courage to take them." He kissed her then, slow and sure, as the sea whispered below. When they returned home, their life resumed not in grand declarations, but in the rhythm of days. Alexander started teaching once a week at a local university, guest lectures on business ethics, his favorite subject. Julia launched a non-profit supporting women entrepreneurs, mentoring young girls who reminded her of herself. They still had arguments about schedules, about Lena's screen time, about whether the dishwasher should be loaded efficiently or correctly. But their fights were different now, gentler, rooted in trust. On the one-year anniversary of their wedding, Julia hosted a small dinner on the rooftop of their San Francisco apartment. Close friends, family, no speeches, just gratitude. She stood at the edge of the terrace as the sun dipped below the horizon and thought back to that night at the gala, the beginning of it all. She had walked into that room with walls around her heart, dressed in armor she didn't, yet know she wanted to shed. And then she had kissed a man who quietly, without ever pushing, had loved her for years. It turned out that love wasn't found in grand gestures or perfect timing. It lived in the willingness to stay, to forgive, to build something that could withstand the weight of life's imperfections. And Julia? She had kissed the millionaire at the gala, and in doing so, she had found not just love, but a life, one that was hers, one that was full. Julia's journey began with a kiss that awakened a love she never thought she deserved. From the lavish gala in San Francisco to the sunlit coast of Amalfi, her story with Alexander unfolded not in perfection but in vulnerability, reconciliation and resilience. Their love wasn't born from fairy tales but forged through pain, patience and truth. Alexander, the elusive millionaire, had always loved her quietly, waiting for the right moment not to claim her, but to earn her trust. Julia, once guarded by past betrayal, discovered that true love isn't loud, it's consistent, forgiving and brave. Together they built a life where second chances weren't just given but honored. Their path reminds us that healing doesn't always come quickly, but when it does, it changes everything. Life lesson. The most profound relationships aren't built on perfect beginnings, but on the courage to grow, heal and choose each other, every day. In real life, love demands effort, understanding and an open heart. It teaches us that no matter our past, we are always worthy of a new beginning. If we learn to forgive, to speak honestly and to trust again, we too can write a new chapter, one full of meaning and joy. Mini quiz. Your turn. What mattered most to Julia in choosing to love Alexander again? A. His wealth and status. B. His emotional honesty and loyalty. Comment your answer below. A or B. What about you? Do you believe in second chances in love? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can hear everyone's perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us and keep the stories coming.